Profile share via email report story. Nami was no stranger to the stories regarding the morning after. Some would say it was awkward, others couldn't even tell the story due to their one-night stand walking out on them before sunrise. For her, it was pure bliss. Last night, they made love, and she had come to discover that it was Luffy's first time as well. It was absolutely amazing. He seemed to have gotten the hang of it after a while, and although it was a little painful for her at first as well, before long, they were both subjected to mind-numbing pleasure. Seeing his flushed face and glistening skin hovering over her was an image that she will forever engrave in her mind. With closed lids, her lips stretched into a smile as she regained consciousness. It was the added warmth she noticed first. It was something she hadn't felt since she was a little girl when she'd wake up in Nojiko's arms after a bad nightmare. The warmth presented itself in the way his arms were wrapped snugly around her, keeping her close to his naked body. Her chest fluttered when she remembered that she too was naked underneath her cotton bed sheets, and the way their bodies molded together made her heart thump. She then noticed his breathing. Her head was on his chest, tucked underneath his chin, and she could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat while his soft breathing made her head rise and fall. Cracking her eyes open, she ever so carefully writhed her head from underneath his chin. No longer feeling overcome with sleep, she glanced over his features. Her lips parted in fascination at the man before her. The light that seeped through her windows bounced off his eyelashes, and she was intrigued at how long they were. "He's so cute." Her eyes then fell upon his scar, and she carefully raised her hand, using her index finger to trace the small lines of marred skin with furrowed brows. Trailing down to his nose, she used the tip of her finger to gently glide over the arch of it. "He has a really cute nose too." She let out a breathy chuckle. It truly was ironic. The one thing she insisted upon herself, not letting him become her distraction, was now all she could think about. She brought her finger down to his mouth and began gently outlining his lips. Oh, how she loves those lips. She could kiss them all day. Luffy slowly blinked, his eyes open to find her touching his face, however she was too captivated by him to notice. Only when he cracked a growing smile was when she ceased her motions. "Good morning, Nami," he murmured against her finger. A red haze began to creep its way onto her cheeks, and she retracted her hand before they made eye contact. "Good morning," she replied groggily, mirroring his smile. The pair said nothing for a moment. They both merely gazed at one another with sparkling eyes and cheesy grins, filling the atmosphere with a bubbly warmth. Promoted stories. You'll also like 3D2YA One Piece fanfic. 370k 6.2k. Luffy stumbles upon Nami by chance on a small island after the crew was separated at Sabayati Archipelago. The two decide to train together, but then comes the warm, "We're by your side." 32.8k 802. Currently editing Book 1. No regrets, right? Book 2. Gomen. Captain, this is the third book in my Luffix Reader series. If you haven't read the first two, I suggest do. I need you more. 22.5k 307. In the wake of their new victory in Wano, time spilled into the hands of Luffy and Nami. Recognition of their silent feelings wailed in their hearts like aches. Kraken, my captain soft sighed, Luffy x Nami. 4.8k 66. As Nami is working in her room, she decides to take a small break, so she walks out and looks at the sea. After a few minutes she looks at the place Luffy is usually sitting. Let me help you. A Luffy x Nami fanfic. 211k 2.6k. After Luffy's battle with Doflamingo at Dressrosa, Luffy is now once again reunited with Sabo. Reuniting with Sabo somehow made Luffy remember about Ace and Hadarioke. Daughter of the Sea, One Piece. 22.3k 886. You are invited to read the tales of the woman who would soon rule the hearts of many in the seas alongside the Strafut pirates. One Piece X Black Reader Majority of T. Endless Loyalty. 3.7K74. Revolving Light Spoiler Alert. Revolving Light, there are spoilers ahead, you have been warned. Desperate for a new start, Rhea joins Luffy and his crew as they head towards the Grand Line. Soon aft, Nami eventually placed a delicate hand atop his cheek before caressing it gingerly with her thumb, and it made his heart swell. Luffy knew love wasn't supposed to be painful, but the way his chest felt like it was going to burst open any minute proved otherwise. And now, the pain only intensified after connecting with Nami in such an intimate way. He'll learn to live with it though, because he'd do anything for Nami. His lover, "What you doing?" he asked. "Looking at you." She replied as honestly as she could, her face completely relaxed. Slowly, he gravitated towards her, and they bumped noses, orange and raven bangs weaving together when he let out a breathy chuckle. Last night was awesome, he mused. Her breath hitched when she saw him move closer, and with droopy eyes, she whispered, "It was," before tenderly pressing their lips together. She'll never grow tired of the way his lips moved against hers or the way his kisses rendered her breathless each and every time. He took a rapid breath when she pulled away and decided that she ended the kiss way too soon. Feeling dissatisfied, he quickly moved in to draw another languid kiss from her, to which she happily obliged. Nami hummed delightedly against his lips and smoothed her hand back to gently run her fingers through his hair. He loves when she does that. Every single touch makes his heart run rampant. Both of them were completely lost in the feeling of each other's lips and soft caresses, and she could feel how her heart thumped in unison with his now due to how tightly their bare chests were pressed together. Luffy unwillingly pulled away from her to breathe, and his parted lips formed yet another cheesy grin against hers. Feeling completely light and giddy, Nami found herself wishing this moment would never end. Nothing could ruin it, until her bedroom door suddenly swung open. "Nami, have you seen?" Nami immediately propped herself up with an elbow, whipping her head erratically in the direction of the intruder, and was met with a wide-eyed, gawking older sister. "My car keys." She trailed, a very wide chestier cat-like grin began splaying across her lips. "Nojiko, get out," Nami blurted with a magnificent blush adorning her face as she gripped her thin bed cheek to her generous chest. Meanwhile, the man beside her was completely unfazed. In fact, he raised his neck up a bit and lifted a hand to greet her without a care in the world. "Yo, Nojiko." "Hi, Luffy." She cooed, very much enjoying Nami's embarrassed, frazzled state. She'd be teasing her about this for a very long time. Nami sat up to snatch a throw pillow from the foot of the bed whilst gripping her sheet close to her. "Out!" she barked before she hurled it at the door. The pillow was fast, however, Nojiko was faster. She slammed the door shut before it reached her and erupted in laughter from the other side before heading out the front door, leaving behind a very flustered Nami. With an annoyed huff, she sank right back into her boyfriend's arms. There was a moment of silence where they just looked at each other, their lips forming goofy smiles, and soon, as much as they tried to choke back their laughter, it began rumbling out of them joyously. When their laughter ceased, she reached out to wipe the tears that had formed in his ducts from the intense outburst and gave him a warm smile. "We should probably get up now." Yet, Luffy found his current dilemma oddly intriguing. He never slept more than 5 hours and he hated staying in bed, usually finding it to be a waste of time. However, it was different now that he woke up with Nami by his side, as he found it increasingly difficult to move. Wrapping his arms back around her waist, he pulled her flush to him. "No. Nami." he joked, whining like a child as he nuzzled his face into the crook of her neck, pulling giggles and gasps from the woman. She gripped his shoulders and tried to pull him away as she thrashed her head about from the tickle assault. Luffy, let go, she laughed. His laughter mixed in with her own as he buried his face deeper within the crevice. Nope, he spat. Her laugh was sweet music to his ears. Inhaling deeply, she began, I'll make you breakfast if you let go. She cried, cheeks hurting from the intense smile she had plastered on her face. At this, he completely ceased his motions and jolted up. Really? He beamed, looking down at her with eyes full of excitement. Wow, it was that easy. With a nod, she affirmed, really, before sitting up to move off the bed before changing into a fresh pair of clothes. In record time, Luffy slipped his clothes back on before dragging Nami away. Standing in the kitchen, she shuffled around, digging through the fridge and cupboards in search of what to cook to satiate his bottomless pit of a stomach. Let's see. She hummed in contemplation and pulled out an array of ingredients. Let's go with pancakes, eggs, and bacon. How does that sound? She inquired, turning to face him while throwing her hair up in a ponytail. That sounds good. He nearly drooled at the mention of food. Can I help with anything? Know how to crack eggs? She inquired, now tying an apron behind her back. He nodded furiously. Standing on her toes to grab a mixing bowl from the cupboard, she set it down on the counter in front of Luffy. Could you crack 4 eggs in there, please? Yup. Reaching inside the carton, he went to work. As she measured out the dry ingredients, she couldn't help sneaking a peek over at him. She always loved the faces he made when he was trying to concentrate. His tongue was sticking out and his brows were pinched together. Then she eventually saw him dig out a piece of eggshell. Chuckling internally, she shook her head at his antics. After a few attempts, Luffy smiled widely, sliding the bowl along the counter to let her inspect his egg-cracking skills. All done, she peeked inside. Perfect, she said, beginning to combine the ingredients in the mixing bowl. After cleaning up a bit, he moved to stand behind her at the stove, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin atop her shoulder to peek at her pouring the mixture on the pan. Nami, is it almost ready? He whined, becoming impatient. She turned to look at him from over her shoulder and eyed his lips. Damn, his pout was irresistibly adorable. Almost, Luffy, she replied before turning back to flip the pancakes. Chuckling internally, her lips tugged upward into a warm smile. She'd be lying if she said the thought of them being married and cooking together every weekend hadn't crossed her mind. It felt really nice spending time with him like this. Would he like that? Soon, the dining table had several plates of pancakes, bacon, and scrambled eggs scattered across it. With a fork and knife in hand, Luffy deeply inhaled the scent, drooling at the sight. It smells so good. He licked his lips. Walking to the fridge, Nami pulled out a pitcher of orange juice and poured him a glass before setting it down next to his plate. Dig in. Luffy mumbled a quick, "Itadakimasu," and after scarfing down his food, he placed his fork on the empty plate, exhaling a loud satisfied sigh. Man, that was delicious. Thanks, Nami. He exclaimed, patting his stomach. You're welcome. She smiled. She really loved seeing him happy. Honey orbs clashed with onyx ones as he suddenly gazed at her with an unusual glint in his eyes. What is it? She asked. Wanna do it again? What? She stuttered, swallowing thickly. Was he talking about sex? He affirmed, his dark eyes never wavering from hers. With enlarged eyes and parted lips, she began to feel heat rush to her core, her heart beating erratically upon remembering how amazing he felt inside of her last night. How is it possible for him to make her lose her senses with one little word? As Nami opened her mouth to answer, she was interrupted by the sound of Luffy's cell phone ringing. Great, he groaned vexingly and muttered, "Sorry, Nami," before pulling the cell phone from his pants pocket. However, once he eyed the screen, his face contorted in confusion before answering. Ji-chan, blank. Nami smoothed down her periwinkle blue baby doll dress outside the front door of Luffy's townhouse, running her hands quickly down the length to flatten any wrinkles. Are you sure I look okay? Luffy placed a hand on her shoulder and leaned in to place a kiss on her forehead. You look beautiful, Nami. She took a deep breath and nodded. Thanks, Luffy. With a smile, he replied, "You're welcome. Come on in." Vice Admiral Garp has always been a busy man, however, despite his hectic schedule, he always made time for two things: food and family. Now, after learning that he'd be in town visiting, Luffy hopped on the opportunity to introduce Nami to him. Flash forward to tonight, Nami was a nervous wreck. Luffy had many stories to tell regarding the Admiral, making her fully aware of his complex personality. But nonetheless, he was Luffy's grandfather and she wanted to make a good impression. She walked up the small flight of stairs that led to the front door and saw that Sabo was already waiting to greet her inside the foyer with a glass of wine in hand. Good evening, Nami, he smiled. Feeling relieved to remember that Ace and Sabo would also be joining them tonight, she bowed slightly, reciprocating his smile. Good evening, Sabo. Is the food ready yet? Luffy asked, shutting the front door behind her. Sabo pointed behind him towards the dining room. Yup, the old man is waiting at the table. With a nod, Luffy took a step forward, flashing her an assuring smile. Ready, Nami. Keeping her confident demeanor, she nodded. Nami followed Luffy to the dining room where she was met with what seemed to be an older version of Luffy. He looked intimidating, however, there was something about his eyes and face-splitting smile that reminded her of her boyfriend. The similarities were striking. You must be Nami, he boomed as soon as he saw her figure emerge into the dining room. Yes, sir, it's a pleasure to meet you. She gave the man a court bow before settling in her seat. The pleasure is mine, young lady, and please, call me Garp. He flashed her a toothy grin. Well, he seems nice enough. Luffy took a seat next to Nami, raising a hand to greet the man. Hey. Ji-chan, Luffy, you look well. He continued, Hancock sends her regards. Tensing upon hearing that name, Luffy averted his eyes, grunting in response. Nami noticed his odd reaction, and side-eyed him with furrowed brows. That was odd. Who's Hancock? Shortly after Ace and Sabo joined the table, they began passing around the food, making small talk for a while. The evening was going better than she anticipated for the most part though. Nami, I heard you also attend Logue University. Garp questioned before ripping off a huge piece of meat from its bone. Unintentionally, her eyebrow twitched. Now I see where Luffy gets it from. That's right. She replied, I'm majoring in cartography. I've always wondered, why cartography? Ace inquired. Nami hummed in consideration, placing her fork down. There's just something thrilling to me about making maps. I believe they help you perceive the world differently. Unfortunately, cartography is becoming a dead trade, but I hope to ignite a spark within the surveying community. There's just so many benefits to cartography. Like what? Garp asked, curiosity flashing across his features. Well, when precise and elaborate maps are created, their relevance can help change the world. For example, aiding disaster relief teams. Disaster management allows those teams to understand the layout of the ground just by looking at a map, meaning quicker response times and more lives saved. Garp crossed his arms in front of him, nodding as she spoke. That makes sense. You seem like a very bright young lady, Nami. Very impressive, Sabo chimed in. Luffy smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. Isn't she great? Nami's the smartest person I know. In that moment he felt his heart swell with pride. Blushing, she muttered a soft, thanks, too embarrassed to admit how much she loved hearing that. I owe a lot to my mother. She continued, she was my biggest cheerleader and she always inspired me to chase my dreams. And now I'm so grateful to have Luffy doing the same. There was a comfortable silence at the table as they exchanged warm smiles. Luffy tells me your mother was also in the Navy. Garp asked. Nami nodded. She was. And very proud of it too. She let out a breathy chuckle. She sounds like an amazing woman. Ace said before taking a sip of water. She is. Nami smiled. Nami, I'd love for you to join us tomorrow night. We're throwing a grand soiree in honor of my retirement. Garp stated, discarding his dirty napkin on his plate after wiping his mouth. Oh, I. She was a bit taken aback by the sudden invitation. Looking to Luffy, she eyed him for an answer. He intertwined their fingers from under the table and gave her hand a light squeeze. Taking that as confirmation, she continued, I'd love to thank you for the invitation. She smiled. Wonderful. He laughed heartily before standing. Luffy, come help me clean up a bit. Luffy nodded, gathering the dirty dishes from the table before trailing behind Garp into the kitchen. Hopefully Hancock won't cause a scene at the party, mumbled Ace under his breath as soon as they turned the corner. Sabo elbowed his side with a frown. Behave, he retorted sotto voce. Directing her attention to the brothers, Nami pinched her brows together, frowning a bit. Speaking of which, who's Hancock? She asked. The awkward silence weighed heavily in the air. It was clear that there was some sort of tension between this so-called Hancock and the monkey family. So, she asked again, raising a questioning brow. Downing the rest of his wine, Sabo suddenly spoke. Years ago, Hancock's grandfather worked alongside Gramps as his right-hand man in the Marines. There was a terrible accident on one of their missions that left Hancock's grandfather on his deathbed. Apparently, he took a bullet for Gramps. Ace added, wow, he must have really cared for Garp-san. She retorted, wide-eyed. Sabo continued, he did. Gramps owed him his life. And well, I'm guessing he felt guilty over the entire ordeal and asked Hancock's grandfather if there was anything he could do to repay him and it turns out there was. Which was? She inquired, already not liking where this conversation was going due to the troubled look on their faces. Both Ace and Sabo exchanged glances before turning back to her. A wedding, Ace replied. At his answer, she couldn't help but furrow her brows in fear and confusion. What do you mean? She stuttered, recalling Luffy's reaction from earlier. Noting her skittish glare, Sabo continued hesitantly. As a child, Hancock was obsessed with Luffy and that obsession only grew the older they got. Hancock's grandfather only ever lived for one thing once his wife and children passed away and that was his grandchildren, primarily Hancock. So in order to repay Hancock's grandfather, Gramps agreed to an arranged marriage between Luffy and Hancock. Trying her best to remain calm, Nami just stared completely frozen. She felt like her heart had dropped to her stomach and she also suddenly felt physically sick. Why hadn't he said anything to her about this? Ace immediately interjected. You have nothing to worry about though, Nami. Once Luffy was old enough to find out, he was completely against it and although it took many years, he eventually convinced Gramps to end the arrangement. Their relationship suffered but at least now Luffy can be with whoever he wants to be with, said Sabo. After hearing this, her shoulders dropped a bit. And Hancock? She asked. Still as obsessed as ever, unfortunately, retorted Ace. Great. Nami couldn't help but swallow nervously. She was hoping he wouldn't say that. Looks like she'll be in for a very interesting time tomorrow night. To be continued. A.N. Hey guys. I hope you're liking this story so far. I really love seeing the votes and feedback so please don't hesitate to let me know what you think of the story so far. Stay safe. Where stories live, discover now.